In Boston, Massachusetts, the 1974 school year marked the beginning of the most tumultuous years in the city's history. Rather than receiving the quality education they desired and fought for, African American students were forced to endure violence and torment that garnered national attention and instilled fear and hesitancy in otherwise motivated students. Just months prior, in a legal triumph for African American students that acknowledged minorities' rights to a quality education, it was ruled that the Boston School Committee violated the 14th Amendment by ignoring the inequities present between the city's predominantly black and white schools. Further triumph was anticipated to occur through the implementation of a comprehensive plan to bus students as a way to desegregate the schools. However, this plan really led to a tragedy in the city of Boston. Protests and violence sparked and created a division between the city's residents that led the United States to question the efficacy of busing. The United States first triumphed over discrimination in schools after a class action lawsuit known as the Brown v. Board of Education was filed in Kansas in 1951. In 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that separate schools for white and black students were unconstitutional and violated the 14th Amendment. However, no specific method to desegregate schools was formulated. Despite this triumph, de facto segregation, or segregation occurring by fact rather than law, was still widespread. In Boston specifically, the West Roxbury and South Boston neighborhoods remained predominantly Irish American, while Roxbury and South End remained predominantly African American. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, argued that there were inequities present between predominantly white and black schools throughout Boston. Ruth Batson, leader of the Boston chapter of the NAACP, discovered that both test scores and cost per pupil were significantly lower for black students, and the dilapidated schools in Roxbury and South End were unsafe for student attendance. With insufficient funding, schools in these neighborhoods only had access to outdated and oftentimes racially insensitive resources. The rigid dichotomy between white and black schools made it clear that African Americans would not be able to triumph over de facto segregation if the Boston School Committee did not acknowledge the inequities present and take the initiative to resolve them. In 1963, Batson brought forth her findings in a series of meetings with the committee and its chairman, Louise Day Hicks, and demanded that steps were taken to desegregate Boston schools. Hicks, a native to the predominantly Irish South Boston, was a staunch opposer of school integration and instead hoped to preserve the culture of Boston's segregated neighborhoods, such as the one she herself grew up in.
The Boston School Committee had the power and the authority to act and to shape school zoning lines and to determine which students were going to attend which schools. And they consistently made choices that thwarted any sort of efforts to integrate schools throughout the 1960s, and they also did everything they could to deny that they had any role to play in segregating the schools.
In an effort to triumph over the adamance of the Boston School Committee, African Americans formed what was known as the Freedom Movement. From 1963 to 1965, sit-ins, one-day boycotts, and marches were planned, garnering the support of thousands of both black and white Bostonians in surrounding suburbs. Their persistence drew in the attention of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and the Racial Imbalance Advisory Commission was created, which discovered that Massachusetts had 55 racially imbalanced schools. 45 of these were in Boston. In 1965, in a triumph for African Americans who fought tirelessly for the acknowledgement of school segregation and their rights, the Racial Imbalance Act was signed into law, ruling that it was required for the Massachusetts State Board to mandate desegregation plans for racially imbalanced schools. Provided with state grants, Ruth Batson established METCO, or the Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity, a voluntary busing program which enabled 220 out of 24,000 black students to attend properly funded suburban schools. Although the program was a minor triumph, sufficient progress could not be made because the Boston School Committee refused to comply with the newly established law. The NAACP, believing that the educational rights of African Americans were still being blatantly ignored, filed a class action lawsuit against the Boston School Committee known as Morgan v. Hennigan in 1972, which argued that they had failed to comply with the established standards of the Racial Imbalance Act and did not acknowledge the de facto segregation present in Boston schools. Judge W. Arthur Garrity Jr. was randomly assigned to the case, and after 2 years of deliberation, sided with the NAACP and created a court-ordered plan to bus both black and white students to schools in order to achieve racial balance. Garrity's ruling and immediate action were anticipated to be a triumph for Boston's African American students. After years of neglect by the Boston School Committee, the plan acknowledged the constitutional rights of minorities and allowed African American students to attend schools with proper resources and funding. However, The start of Boston's 1974 school year signaled a tragedy for the city. Following his ruling, Judge Garrity paired racially imbalanced schools across the city in order to bus both black and white students between segregated neighborhoods. In the most controversial pairing, buses were sent to predominantly white South Boston High School and predominantly black Roxbury High School. The tragic violence and protests that would occur at South Boston High School spread throughout the city and marked the beginning of years of racial protests. Out of an approximate 4,000 students at South Boston, 321 African American students and only 50 white students attended school on the first day of the busing plan. Fear was instilled in African Americans who did attend and were forced to endure the violence of protesters who lined the city's streets, equipped with bricks and various weapons to hurl at any passing buses.
There were some black people who reacted to desegregation by moving out of the city. A lot of the common man and woman, the average parent, was as concerned about what it meant to their kid as any of the white people were.
Protesters would spit, jeer racial slurs, and even threaten students with violence if they refused to leave. Despite the presence of police outnumbering the number of bus students, widespread violence continued to occur without relief, becoming so severe that students would be escorted out back entrances while decoy buses were sent to distract anti-bussers. In an attempt to provide protection for bus students, Massachusetts Governor Francis W. Sargent mobilized 2 National Guard military police units to prevent further tragedy from occurring. Despite these efforts, protesters persisted, and multiple instances of stoned buses, stabbings, and assaults were reported as the school year progressed. Fearing for their lives, many African American students made the decision to not attend school, which severely limited the education the busing plan was meant to provide. Louise Day Hicks brought national attention to Boston by founding the anti-busing group known as Restore Our Alienated Rights, which allowed white mothers that hoped to preserve their neighborhoods and rights to determine where their children attended school to spread their ideologies through sit-ins and marches across the country. Violence and tragedy carried on into the following school year, and in 1976, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph depicting a white teenager assaulting civil rights activist Ted Landsmark with a flagpole at an anti-busing protest was taken by photographer Stanley Foreman. Using this publicity, African Americans were able to use Boston's tragedy to triumph over school segregation on a national scale by drawing in widespread support and inspiring other cities to utilize tamer busing plans to achieve desegregation and prevent similar tragedies.
People were asking me to leverage the kind of embarrassment that a lot of people in Boston felt at that moment about the fact that they hadn't addressed some of those issues.
A lot of them explicitly said we don't want to become another Boston. So cities like Columbus, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky, watched very closely what was going on. And Boston tried to adapt their plans and their whole approach to how they're going to do busing.
Despite the tragedy that erupted from court-ordered busing, Judge Garrity remained firm in his decision to proceed with his plan. Although triumphs were made in other cities' desegregation efforts that drew inspiration from Boston, the aftermath was tragic for the state of Boston's schools and was a stinging reminder for the United States that prejudice and segregation were still present in the North. Many white anti-bussers decided to move into Boston's surrounding suburbs, and student enrollment plummeted from 100,000 to only 57,000 by 1980. Protests and violence began to diminish after protesters realized that Garrity's decision would remain unchanged. In the city, however, 12 schools were closed because they did not meet Boston's established racial ethnic guidelines, which led to devastating job losses in the education field and lowered test scores. However, the decline in Boston's white population meant that more opportunities arose for African Americans.
It was a political triumph because the personnel of the school system stopped being controlled by Irish Catholics, which is what it had been for decades. The court order broke that.
In the decades following Boston's tragedy, the efficacy of busing as a way to triumph over segregation has improved across the country, as school districts have learned to take into consideration unique neighborhood demographics and the perspectives of parents when creating their plans. As of 2013, Boston still remains one of the most segregated cities in the United States. The city's busing system has been dramatically reduced, and METCO still remains in place to accommodate the school system's now 78% minority student body. Although a busing plan is still implemented, city and school officials have begun to allow parents to send their children to neighborhood schools, and Boston schools have begun to resegregate, leading to concerns of the resurgence of racial and economic divide. In a nation where the educational rights of African Americans were neglected for hundreds of years, Boston's busing plan was an anticipated triumph that instead erupted into widespread and lasting tragedy. The events that sparked in the beginning of the city's 1974 school year has left a lingering stain in both Boston and United States history, allowing the efficacy of busing as a means of desegregation to be reconsidered.